welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the third event of the Open Science Meets Qualitative Research campaign from the Open and Responsible Science team, let's say. And so just for you to know, so today we have this event on sharing qualitative research, data and materials. And the next two coming events on the 13th of April, this is here as well in the Q building, Analytical Transparency and Reproducibility Roundtable. Also, there's going to be a workshop. And on the 25th, this is on ISS in The Hague. Who does open research benefit? Okay. So just for you to know. And so I'm going to introduce our speaker. We're going to do a bit of a lecture, then we go to the workshop, and then we come back with a few learning parts from that. All right, so Edward, clap bike. Okay, I got it almost right. He's the research data steward from the ESSB school, so the Erasmus School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Edward was raised in Rotterdam and went to Leiden University to be trained in developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. After obtaining his PhD at Leiden University Medical Center, he worked as a data-driven management consultant. Then he returned to academia to work as a postdoc focusing on reproducible science at Leiden University and Erasmus University. As a research data steward, Edward offers support on all things related to research data management. He also has a keen interest in training researchers in data management and reproducible science practices, for which he holds a university teaching qualification and a software carpentry instructor certification. And this is one of the examples that he likes to teach. So I'll give the floor to Edward. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't need that one. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. And sorry, yeah, I wrote down this once, this bio. Wasn't really meant to it had like this breakers, tongue breakers in it. But anyway, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to talk about qualitative research data and ways to share that data and the process of doing qualitative research. And yeah, to be fair, maybe you already heard it, my background is mainly in quantitative science, but a long time ago when I was a student, I also did some qualitative interviews, and I really enjoyed that, so that's also why I like to focus on qualitative research today. But also I think, if I talk, if I can speak for the like open science people or open data people, I think we focused a bit too much on qualitative science, and we assumed that like quantitative, it's all the same. It's probably a bit more nuanced, but I think there is some work to be done to see how we can think of open science and open data for qualitative data. So I'm very happy to try to come up with some suggestions or solutions today. And for the sake of sharing materials, here's a link to the slide. So if you already want to have a look or look it up later, you can use this QR code. The slides are on Zenodo. I will also put this back up on the screen at the end of the workshop. And I just remembered that I forgot to include a slide with the program of today, but maybe it's good to inform you a little bit about that. So my plan is to talk for about 30 minutes and also have a bit of a conversation during those 30 minutes with you. And after that, there's more really a workshop part where we do an exercise. We're going to look at qualitative data and see if we can think of what we can share. But I will explain that. But so it's about 30-40 minutes introduction, and then about 30-40 minutes working together, and then a wrap-up of about 10 minutes. So that's the program for this afternoon. And after that, drinks. So something to look forward to. Okay, so maybe just to be on the same page, I know it's some people say it's impossible or not really helpful to define what is qualitative data or what is qualitative research, but I think to be a bit on the same level, I just came up with yeah, something is not really groundbreaking, but just to be on the same page. So what do we consider qualitative data? Non-numeric data, mostly unstructured data. So this is also compared to quantitative data that's more numeric and more structured, mostly. And one interesting feature of qualitative data, especially if we look at qualitative data collected from human participants, is that participants determine the initial conceptual response categories in most cases, as opposed to in quantitative science, where it's the researcher who comes up with the response categories that can be chosen from. So I think that's also an important distinction. And today, when I talk about qualitative data, I mainly have ordinary language data in mind. That's also, I think, the data that in the end could be shared most easily, but of course there are artifacts or stuff like that can also be qualitative data. But yeah, for now, I focus mainly on ordinary language data. And then some examples at Erasmus University Rotterdam that I have seen or that I know of at least. Quite some people I think are doing qualitative research or mixed method research where qualitative research is a part of it. So think of interviews, focus groups, participant observation, document review, and then the data types that are being used are audio, video, transcriptions of, for example, focus groups or interviews. Field notes, people really go into the field and write down things about what they see, what they experience, and also documents in archives, for example. So there is a huge variety of approaches, both from an epistemological point of view and also from a methodological view. But my approach today is to find a bit of common ground between all those different approaches, also between or within quantitative and qualitative science. And also I think we should acknowledge that there is a lot of pluriformity, and I think we should celebrate that. But it also means that a lot of things that I might discuss might not hold for all types of qualitative research. And it's interesting to see if we can discuss that. So let's start with the question, why should you care about sharing qualitative data at all? Well, just a very simple reason is it's more or less a duty when you are employed at a Dutch university. We have a code of conduct for research integrity, and there it's stated for all publications, data is open and accessible to the extent possible, and it remains confidential to the extent necessary. So open as possible, closed as necessary. Of course, there is some, you already feel there is some, what's possible, there is some negotiation room there. But I would say, in general, if you can, you should share your data. That's the simple translation of this code of conduct. But we can also look at it from a more positive side. I have this nice pointer. So there are also benefits, I think a lot of benefits for science and for society. So for scientific fields and science in general. So if you share more of your data and your materials, you show more of what you did, and others are then able to examine like the justification for your claims, also the comprehensiveness of your claims. So that's an important part. I will come back to that also in the next slides. It also enables other investigators to conduct novel research with the same data set. If you really are able to publish a whole data set, then others can reuse the data. And that maximizes the scientific findings from a project, and it can also reduce the burden placed on participants. So especially people from smaller or underrepresented communities, if instead of that they are solicited repeatedly, people can reuse the data. Of course, in a lot of circumstances, vulnerable communities, it's harder to share the data, and you should think of the ethical reasons to share or not to share. But in general, participants usually want their data to be reused. There's a reason why they participate in research. So yeah, if it's possible, it's also from that for that reason good to share your data. Okay, this is a bit more about this analytical transparency. So if you share your data, it also helps to the readers of your articles or books to get more access to the interpretive process through which you as a researcher, as a scholar, came to your conclusion. So it can help more understanding. And of course, in an article or in a book, usually it's hard to, for example, share all the interview questions or the whole methods, and data repositories are a better way to share all the materials. And I think another argument is also that it could really help to stimulate collective reflection and learning. So, for example, if you share your whole interview scheme, then other researchers can see good examples of what a good interview looks like. And also from this Reyes article, there's also very nice, she's an ethnographer, and she talks about sharing field notes, for example. And that's not usually done because these field notes are usually not very structured or just written down. But she really uses that as a training opportunity. So she asked students to write it down, so the students can really learn about what to do in the field, how to make notes in a good way. And also, she said, like, it helped herself to reflect on how I work in the field, how I make my notes. So I think, there are a lot of learning opportunities here as well. So this is from that same article, and it's about ethnographic transparency, very interesting. Sometimes it's also good to, name the specific communities in which you do research. There are, of course, debates like whether that's a good idea, because sometimes it can be not very good for the participants. But another branch of transparency is sharing the data, such as interview guides or field notes. So that's if you want to read more on that, really recommend that article. So, okay, I've talked a little bit now, but I'm also interested to hear a bit from you. So maybe something that was implicit so far is the concept of reproducibility and replicability. And I'm not saying that that's the main reason or even a reason at all to share qualitative data and methods, but that's of course where the open science movement comes from a big part. They say, oh, we need to have reproducible, replicable research. So just for the definitions, I know there are definitions switched around a lot of times about reproducibility and replicability, but reproducibility is the ability to obtain the same results using the same data and analysis, and replicability is then using the same method and analysis on another data set and see if you get similar results. So these are really concepts coming from quantitative methods. But I'm interested if you have ideas. Does this concept or does these concepts make sense for qualitative data at all? Do you have opinions about that? Do you say yes, that shouldn't matter, or do you see problems for your own research, for example? Nice. Oh, and if you like, you could also introduce shortly yourself. What kind of research topic you were working on, and which school?
My name's Lisa, and I'm a junior researcher in one of the strategic projects, and we do research on how we can evaluate the societal impact of research and education. And we also work on methods, on how we can work on that. And I come from a qualitative research background. And I struggle with this idea of reproducibility, and because I feel like the methods we create are there to test things. For example, we just did a project on the societal impact of education of a minor, And there we worked with a tool that's used for something else, and we tried to appropriate it. So I see a lot of room there to share this tool, of course, and to be used in other cases to evaluate other things, but not with the intention of getting the same results or similar results. So I think there is a possibility to share how we approached it and how we did it, but more in terms of, hey, see how you can fit this with what you're doing, but not with this idea of, oh, you can do exactly what we did and it will fit in what you're doing.
So that's, you say like it's not an ideal that would work for at least your qualitative research to really reproduce it.
I see it as starting points. I see it as inspiration. I see it as learning from what others have done to adapt it, but not with the idea of we will get exactly what you've done.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, maybe someone else has to say something. Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Lisanne and I work at EMC and I have a background in qualitative research. And at this moment I'm transcribing focus groups and coding them. And when you go to the more traditional qualitative research and coding, and there's always a bit of subjectivity. And that's why it's very important to describe the person who is doing the coding and maybe have a second coder and see whether or not you agree. But there will always be some kind of subjectivity, and that's why I think the reproducibility of an exact same or similar coding tree or something, I don't even think that it's necessary. But I think it's a difficult term for qualitative research in that type of traditional research.
Okay, thanks. If you want to add to that.
Hi, my name is Susanna. I'm from the Rotterdam School of Management, from the Strategic Management Entrepreneurship Department. I'm also doing qualitative research. I'm a bit familiar with the references that you put below. So if I remember correctly, it's the Guinness and Solarino paper who says yes to this question, but Prat et al. Says no.
Interesting discussion to look up. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
So I think I remember from the Guinness papers that they were really very, very, very able to put qualitative research and map it to quantitative research and see like the similarities between the two. But then the Prat et al. Paper said no, this is not working at all for qualitative research. It's actually not reproducibility, replicability that works for qualitative research, but it's more about trustworthiness. Yeah. So in qualitative research, it's just super hard to observe the same events over and over again that you're observing. So, reproducibility and replicability, it's just impossible because events just don't simply reoccur. So what they argue in that paper is that it's about trustworthiness. So you have to convince your reader that the events that you're observing are observed in a correct way, in a trustworthy way, and that you are noting all your observations correctly and interpreting them correctly. You need to be trustworthy towards your readers. That's a bit the main point in that paper.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a great summary, I think, of that paper, and also very important concept, I think. I would also say that for most qualitative methods, trustworthiness is maybe more important. And I think that also needs more, or a certain level of transparency. So just to also summarize this discussion a little bit. So if replication is a desirable goal, then transparency is a required step. So if you are from that school, transparency makes sense. But even, I think, without a commitment to replication, some form of openness to what you did and how you did your analysis, how you came up with your claim, how you did your coding. Like, even if you agree that it's very subjective, that every person does it differently, then somehow sharing information about the coding process can at least help others to see your perspective. So I think that's a very good way of looking into this and thinking about transparency and trustworthiness. And another reason I think why we should consider sharing as much data and materials as possible. Maybe a related question, also looking a bit at the time, but so this is from my experience in my field. When I look at a method section of a paper, I usually don't fully understand what people did. So I'm very happy that people start more and more to, for example, publish their code. And if they describe it well, so this is more about computer code, but if they describe it well, at least for me, it's much easier to grab what they did. And I think this is for this can also hold for qualitative research. So the question is, like, if you read an article, is it usually enough to understand what has been done, or do you need more? And do you have ideas of what you need? So it's a twofold question. So is it usually enough, or do you have ideas of what things you like to see when you read other materials or research?
I think if I read papers with qualitative research, it seems incredibly polished and super structured. They usually have like this incredible, beautiful model with all these lines, and it seems like super clear. Like, why can't you come up with this like immediately? But I think this is not how qualitative research really works out. It starts as an incredibly messy process. And what's really missing currently with published research is that you cannot see anything of the messiness. It's just, it looks like this entire research project was designed from the beginning, in clear research question, data that perfectly fits the research question, and it just magically drops into this perfectly structured model. But obviously this is not reality, and this is what I'm missing really. How do researchers come to these steps, to this incredibly beautiful published research from this complete mess that they started with?
And what would help you then? Is it a better description of what they did, or more like raw materials, or like, do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, well, I think this is a ball in front of an open goal. I think open science is the answer here. Yeah, so really, if researchers could publish their messiness that they started with, I think this was really going to help understanding these models. Yeah.
And maybe if that becomes more the norm, then it's also easier to do, because it is also scary. So the same with like the analogy with publishing your computer code. It took me a long time before I felt confident enough to do that. But yeah, only after seeing other people that I really respect that also made mistakes in their code and shared that. I think the same might also hold for like the messiness. If that's the norm that you show, like, okay, this is the messiness where we started with and we ended up with this nice analysis, then yeah, hopefully people feel more confident in sharing these things. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, I had another question, but maybe in light of time. So maybe another question is what extra stuff do you need for reusability? So maybe it's something to think about in the practical part. So we already discussed a bit of the challenges also. So subjectivity of the qualitative data is one of the things why people say, well, it's so subjective, I'm just not able to share it because no other researcher could really understand it beyond me, because that's only the original researchers can really understand the data. And there is a risk of misinterpretation or incomplete interpretation by others if I'm going to share it. I think a few points that can be said to that is, well, I think objectivity. So one of the things is also if you have this subjective data set and you put it in a repository, as it is a very objective data point, that can be analyzed objectively, that seems a bit strange. But I think objectivity may not be the goal in that sense. So it's also about the other perspectives on the data, on the process, that are valuable. And right now, I think a lot of people share just their results, because if you publish, then yeah, you also share something of your data and materials, but in a very abstract way or summarized way. And sometimes people publish like selections, quotes from interviews, for example. And then I think in that case, the full data always gives a bit more context than just the things you chose to share. And then sharing sensitive data, I think this is a very important point, and we should always take that into account, especially if we study vulnerable groups. That sometimes it could harm study participants, and if you really have reasons to or the kind of research that really might harm your participants if the data will be open, and of course you shouldn't just open it up for the whole world. And then sometimes the solution might be to de-identify and anonymize data, but that is very time consuming, so that's a big challenge, I think. And another point is, if you are going to anonymize the data, it may introduce all kinds of inaccuracies and confusion. So one solution, I don't think there's a full solution to this. There's always, on a case-by-case basis, something to discuss also with the ethical committees. But sometimes anonymization is necessary. Sometimes certain access restrictions, I will come back to that later, are necessary. So you say, okay, I'm going to share it with other researchers or specific other researchers, not with the whole world. And in that case, it's good to think about that and budget for these tasks. So for the task of anonymizing, yeah, it is a burden, but you can at least try to see if you can budget for that in your project. And if you're going to anonymize, choose your anonymization scheme carefully. I will come back to anonymization also. Quick point about, I'm talking about sharing a lot, but I think it's good to think of the distinction between sharing your data with the outside world and archiving your data internally at your university or at Erasmus University Rotterdam in this case. So in a data repository, it will always be a selection. So and sometimes the selection part of that can be personal data if you have consent from the participants. But in many cases, in the archive, in many cases, there's no personal data to be stored on the data repository. But in the archive, which is closed, you have the full documentation of your data. So it's good to keep that in mind, that today we're discussing mostly this part, like the data repository, what can you share, but this is like something that you should always do, like really archive your data well to later check back and for the integrity of the data. So what are the things that you can share? I would say like everything that helps to understand the data, to understand the analysis you did, or that helps to justify the claims, could be shared. And also things that are suitable for reuse. So you can think of interview questions, observation guides, topic lists, coding queries, field notes, so all the things that don't fit in a journal article or in a book, they can be part of a data package that can be published on a repository, and that can then also be linked to from the publication. And then, of course, transcripts or even the recordings themselves. In some cases, it is possible to also publish that, but I say that can be tricky for ethical reasons, for reasons of the work, the burden of work for anonymizing data. So I would say, not sure if everyone agrees with me, but I think if we already start with the materials, that's already a big step forward from where we are now. And I think, the transcripts themselves, Sometimes if it's really useful and the circumstances are right to do it, that also makes sense. But I would say focus more on these materials. And that's also something we're going to do in the exercise later on. So some practical steps, anonymization of qualitative data. In that case, you really need to plan ahead. So, for example, ask for consent to share pseudonymous versions of the transcripts. Sometimes it's also good to instruct participants to not mention their full name or their position or others on record, so it makes it easier to later, and it's just less work to anonymize if they don't do that. And think of the ways in which you remove direct and indirect identifiers from transcripts. There are also, good practices to do that. And this is a very nice slide from my colleague Joanna Mania, who gave a whole presentation on anonymization of qualitative data, which is also on Zenodo. And always, if you think about anonymization, consider it together with informed consent. So we have nice templates to use. Try to ask for consent to share the personal data, if that's, if you think that makes sense in your project. And always be careful if you're going to promise full anonymization, because with qualitative data, that is just very hard. So it's better to promise less than to overpromise. And think of controlled access. So sometimes you can restrict access only for academic research, only for training, or only upon request. And that's also what you see here in this very nice matrix. So this is a framework to think of the levels of access to the data and also the levels of processing. So you can think of all kinds of combinations of processing and access, and I think this is a very useful framework to think of what you can share and with whom and in what way. So closed access is just really the archive only, keep it locked in your institution, kind of closed. And then controlled is that if someone's going to further use the data, they should ask the researcher, and on a case-by-case basis, it's decided whether that is okay or not. Restricted is similar, but a bit more in an automated way. So, for example, if you say, if people are working at a university or have ethical approval, then in the repository, automatically after they are logged in, they can use the data. So that's restricted access, which makes it also easier for yourself, I think, if you just set rules by which it can be open. And then open data is just data that is openly available. And there is also qualitative data just publicly available with open licenses. So that is a possibility. And then, the levels of processing, so the raw data, it's always a bit of discussion, like what is raw. If you, for example, record interviews, then the audio recordings might be the most raw format, but I think that transcripts could also be considered raw data if it's just a raw transcript. But think of like the most raw form of the data you can think of. And then redacted data is some kind of redaction, for example, for direct and indirect identifiers, or more pre-processed data that's halfway through your analysis. And summarized data is really on a higher level summarized data. And I have some examples. So, for example, if we think of raw data, well, some kind of raw data, in some projects, you will have photographs of faces or interview videos. And in many cases, it might make sense to keep that just closed in the archive. But sometimes there are ways to share with very selective group of researchers interview transcripts with all the names and locations, because that might be needed for reanalysis, and you trust the researcher, and you make an agreement on how to work with the data. Well, and then restricted, for example, images of a political event, maybe from newspapers. Sometimes it also makes sense not to put it just fully in the open, but say, okay, it's available for reuse for other researchers. And public policy documents, well, they are already open, so they can stay open. And then redacted data, some ideas here. So, for example, in some cases, ethnographic field notes that are, to a certain extent, because it's like a redaction already of what you see during these events, they can be so sensitive that it makes sense to keep them closed. And let me see. Oh, yeah. And summarized data. So sometimes closed summarized data. I think mostly that will be data embargoed until publication. Because if you summarize it well, it's not usually sensitive enough to keep it closed. And some open data can be, for example, a summary of the thematic analysis of your interview transcript. So it's a bit different than what you would publish in an article, but it gives much more context. So, and these are just some ideas that come from these articles and that I made up myself, but hopefully this will help you think about the different levels of openness that you can think if you try to think of this matrix. I really liked the approach. And we're going to use this during the exercise, so hopefully we'll see how it works out in practice. Okay, so some practical takeaways before we go to the interactive part. Always, for anything in life, and especially for research data management, start planning early on. Because everything you do in the beginning of a project will help you later on. Try to, when you work, see if you can already prepare your data for archiving and reuse. That will also help yourself, even if you're just going to archive it for yourself. If you think about structuring your data, that will help you. And documenting your data, keep it organized, is also very important. Richly describe it. Think of all the kind of meaning that you keep or get or give to your data. Write it down, because it will also help yourself and later may also help to justify the claims you make. If you're going to anonymize, do it carefully. And I think I said it before, but I think mostly it makes sense to focus on sharing materials over the actual data. I think it's better to, we all have limited amounts of time to focus on the materials that will already be very helpful and usually a bit easier. If you want to read a bit more, you can click those links later. There is, of course, also support from university and faculty level. So we have information on research data management in general. Also, for example, guides about anonymization of qualitative data can be found there. And we have research data stewards at every faculty who can also help you to think about preparing your data materials for sharing. Legal support, privacy, informed consent, it's all, we have it, so you are not on your own, I would say. Also some very interesting guides from other places that are very helpful if you want to look up research data management advice for qualitative data. And maybe before I go to the workshop part, I will check if there are some questions based on what I've said or what we have discussed so far.
Hi, so my name is Marije and I also work at the Erasmus MC and I mainly do interviews. So I have a very practical question because most of my materials are in Dutch and so are the interviews. So I was wondering, how would you deal with like Dutch interviews, and also the codes I give are mostly Dutch, and then when I write up the article I change stuff to English. So, you know, it's very hard to share things when they're, well, I can share it, but obviously not a lot of people can understand it.
Yeah, very good question. I don't have a straightforward answer. I think in general, but maybe others, by the way, if you have ideas, please share them as well. I would say, yeah, you did it in Dutch, so it makes sense to start with that. And for example, on dance, I also have an example data set. I think a lot of that is in Dutch as well. And there are already Dutch researchers who can reuse it or check it. So that's a very good first step. Translation tools are getting much better and better. So maybe at some point you could say, I just give it a go through Google Translate or something else, or be careful with that if it's like sensitive data, of course, but that might also make sense if you say like, okay, I give an automatic translation and I write that down very big, like, take care, it was done in Dutch, it's all Dutch, but just to make more sense of it, yeah, you can share an automatic translation. And if you think it's like super variable data for international researchers, it might make sense to do a really or hire someone to do a proper translation. So that these are the things I could think of from a practical side. But
maybe that's something we'll talk about in the more practical thing, but I'm still struggling a little bit to understand to what extent you really need to share the process of how you got to certain things. I'm especially thinking of how you got to certain codes, or we're talking about methods, how you adapted a method and why you got there. Because to me, it right now seems like it's basically like writing an extra paper just on describing the process. So I'm wondering how to deal with that, to not have it overwhelmed, but also have enough information.
yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it might be hard to find a balance there, but I think also going back to like the learning as a collective, as a field, as a research group, maybe the more you make explicit for yourself, I think the more it will help you also to deliver high quality research. And yeah, maybe it's also trying a bit out, like, okay, sometimes it's just too much work and it doesn't really help anyone much further. And sometimes, you start to do make things a bit more explicit, and it really helps in the process. So I think that's maybe a way to think about it. And again, that also really depends on, I think, the kind of methods that you use, and something I think to discuss with the people who also use those methods and what they think. That's what I would say. Thanks. Okay. I think at the end we also have maybe some more time for questions or discussion. But for now, I want to continue with the exercise. So in the back, we have some things printed out. So we have basically this matrix. And what we were going to do is try to fit materials from maybe our own research projects, if we have, or otherwise from the example cases that I have brought. We also printed that out. And see if we can think of how to put certain elements in the right place. So, spoiler, there's no right place. So I think it's more about like the discussion, how can we approach this, and hopefully that helps also to think about how you can do it in your own research. So, yes. So the question is, how do we group data and materials in this processing and access matrix? So yeah, what kind of data can we share in raw form, in redacted form, or in summarized form? And with what kind of access levels, closed, controlled, restricted, or open, can we share them? You can use your own project as an example. That will be very nice, I think. We have 3 places or 4 places where we can stay, where we can discuss that. So we can together work on a few projects. We can try to make subgroups and try to explain to each other why we should choose certain groupings, and hopefully that will give a good discussion about what to consider when sharing data and materials. And I have 2 example cases. So one is from the Qualitative Data repository. So this is what they shared there. I also have a list somewhere here with like what they really shared openly and what was restricted. So we can later maybe also look, not that that's like the best answer, because they also just made a decision, but we can see how they did it and how that compares to our ideas. And this is one from Dance. So this is a Dutch study, and they also shared quite some of their data. So you can go there, just choose whether you like to come up with a project from yourself or choose one of the examples. I think, looking at the time, we have, let's take about 20 minutes. So 4:15, we come back here and maybe discuss like, how it was and what we learned. And we can try to make groups there. I think that will be, let's go with the flow, I would say. Thank you.
I don't know how much of this material, and you get absolutely no recognition.
Or the code. Yeah.
So,
It helped me so much because we were like the 3 of us and we iterated them.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back. And it was great to hear and see discussions going on. I think in many cases also about your own project. So hopefully this helps as a starting point to think about what to share in your own project. But maybe, let's just ask an open question. Do you have some things that you discussed that you want to share with the other, like with the whole group, or maybe questions? Maybe it was harder than you thought, or maybe it was easier. So, anything that you want to share, please go ahead.
I'm Tamara. I also work, just as Susanna, at the Rotterdam School of Management. Mm-hmm. And it already says it, we are studying organizations. So I study an organization. I'm doing a kind of ethnography, case study type of work. I'm already embedded in the company for 1.5 years. I think like it's very hard for me to share their sensitive data. Yeah. So that's one of the struggles I have. We were talking about, for example, interview data, interview transcripts. I cannot easily share those. So they will always kind of stay on the controlled level. And another thing is that also for my interviewees, it would be I think they would be less likely to tell me things or let me record the interview if they know that it's going to be publicly made available. So I think that's a real challenge in the sense of when working with companies, for example. But I'm really curious how it is if you don't work with a company in more public
Yeah,
data?
I'm not sure if there are people who are working at like a public, how to say, more public organizations, but I think there are also people working with vulnerable groups, and I think there are some similarities there as well, because I think there's also this, we talked about trustworthiness as a researcher, but there's also, so that was more in the sense of trustworthiness towards your peers and towards society, but there's also like a level of trust with your participants, and we should, I think, be careful that sharing data too open doesn't, come in between you and your participants. And in any case, I think it makes sense to already think from the beginning, like, if I'm going to ask them, like, you can only participate if I'm going to record it, and a lot of people say no, or they would change the way they answer, then maybe it's not a good idea to do it. So that's a challenge, and again, something to really plan from the beginning. If you do this at the end, then you can do nothing, but at least from the beginning you can try to see what Antonia.
So just out of curiosity, I can understand, and I think it's perfectly plausible not to want to share the data. But what about the materials? Because I think like a very valid point that Edward has been making during his presentation is that maybe, you cannot share the data, but you can share the materials and how you analyzed this data. So what are your thoughts in your particular field?
I think also that our discussion ended a bit on that point. Like, I think I can share, for example, my interview protocol, the way I did coding, and kind of how models developed. We could share those kind of questions, I think. So that's the first step. That's in this direction.
Yeah,
I think.
And we were discussing this. I think I should put here like data and materials. So that just to focus again on data is a very broad term, but mostly people think of data as like the transcripts or the answers from the participants. But I think we should broaden that to data and materials, and then hopefully this matrix also works. But I think that's a very great step to take to think of the materials that you can share then. Other thoughts or suggestions? Yes.
I think what Antonio always pointed out was also like, what's the point of sharing it? Like, what does it add to your existing research paper? For example, when we talked about the outcomes of your coding, like, what does it really add to what you've already written? And I thought that was a really interesting question to check again of why do you share it? What's the point?
That also I think helps to balance between the amount of work it costs to make it available. Sometimes then it's just too much. Any other thoughts, general points? I also have one more question. So we had this example cases. Anyone really looked at those or not? Otherwise it's also fine, but okay. Then never mind, but it's the links are in the presentation, so if you just want to see... To be honest, I came up with these a bit random, so it's not that I will say, oh, these are perfect examples, but these are examples of people sharing their data and materials, so that's great in any way, and it gives an idea of how you can do it. So, that's just what I wanted to ask and point out. I think it's... Not sure if the drinks are already there, but it's also time maybe to continue the discussion in a even more, I hope it was informal enough here as well, but in an even more informal way. Thank you so much also for your input and participation. That really, also helps me to think about this, and also how we as research data stewards and other support staff at Erasmus University can help researchers to work towards the goal of opening up data and materials. With that I would say thank you so much, and hopefully you will stay... Yeah, I will share the key. Oh yeah, I was going to do that again. Yeah. Then, sorry, all those animations. Make it, whoop. Yes, here it is. Yeah, so if you want to have a look at all those materials from today, you can find it here. Thank you so much, and hopefully see you later during the campaign or at any other event or occasion here at campus. Thank you.